The Cotton Club's back room had a particular quality of silence on Tuesday nights, the kind that settled in after the last set wound down and the kitchen closed, and the only light left was the one above the corner booth, where Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat alone with a glass of whiskey and a book he had been working through for the better part of a week. Not the main room that stayed open until 2, but the back room, the one without a sign on the door, the one that the staff knew to leave alone when that light was on. It was the closest thing to private that Harlem offered a man in his position, which was not very private at all, but on most Tuesday nights it was sufficient. On the Tuesday night in question, which was the 14th of March, 1947, 3 men came through the back room's unmarked door at 22 minutes past 11 carrying intentions they had been paid to carry and a confidence that came from having carried similar intentions on previous occasions without incident. Their names were Clarence Webb, Roy Dexter, and a man called Prince, who had no other name that anyone used, at least not in the circles where his work was known. Webb was the largest of the 3. A former longshoreman from the Brooklyn waterfront who had transitioned into what the newspapers called muscle for hire, and what the people who hired him called more specific things. Dexter was smaller, quicker, the kind of man who made himself useful in tight spaces. Prince had a particular reputation that had nothing to do with his size and everything to do with the quality of his attention, which was absolute, and his patience, which was extraordinary. He was the reason the other 2 were confident. What none of the 3 men knew as they came through that door was that Bumpy Johnson had been expecting them for 11 days. To understand what happened in that back room over the next 3 hours, you need to understand something about how Bumpy Johnson processed information and how he used what he knew about people to accomplish things that force alone could never have accomplished. Because what happened that night was not a fight. It was not a miracle. It was not luck. It was the conclusion of 11 days of careful preparation by a man who had understood, long before those 3 men were hired, that the moment they walked through that door would be an opportunity rather than a threat, provided he was ready for it in exactly the right way. The man who hired Webb, Dexter, and Prince was a numbers operator named Gerald Ashworth, who ran a modest but profitable operation in the eastern section of Harlem that had for several years existed in a kind of grudging parallel to Bumpy's larger organization. The 2 operations had an understanding: Ashworth's territory, Bumpy's territory, boundaries that both sides respected, because respecting them was more profitable than fighting over them. This understanding had held for 4 years, and might have held for 4 more, except that the previous autumn Gerald Ashworth had made a decision that changed the arithmetic of the arrangement in ways he had not fully thought through before making it. The decision was to expand westward, not dramatically, just 3 blocks, a handful of new runners, a modest increase in weekly volume. From Ashworth's perspective, it was a natural growth of an operation that had reached the limits of its current territory, and the 3 blocks in question had been operating informally for years, served by independent runners who reported to no one and kept whatever they collected above a modest street tax that Ashworth had quietly begun, collecting from them without asking anyone's permission. From Bumpy's perspective, those 3 blocks were not unaffiliated territory. They were the eastern edge of a buffer zone that he had deliberately left underserved as a matter of organizational strategy, allowing the independent runners to operate freely because their presence created a natural boundary that prevented exactly the kind of territorial creep that Ashworth was now attempting. The tax that Ashworth had begun collecting from those runners was not, in Bumpy's view, a neutral business decision. It was a declaration made without the courtesy of being stated as one, that the understanding between the 2 operations was no longer operative. he had sent word to Ashworth through the usual channels. The word was measured and specific. The Western expansion needed to stop. The independent runners needed to be returned to their previous status. And a conversation about the appropriate acknowledgement of the transgression needed to happen within the week. The message was delivered. The response, which arrived 3 days later through the same channels, was not what Bumpy had expected. It was not a negotiation or a counterproposal. It was a silence so deliberate that it constituted an answer of its own. The answer of a man who had decided that conversation was not in his interest. Bumpy had understood, receiving that silence, that Ashworth had made a calculation. The calculation was that Bumpy's reputation for preferring intelligence over violence, for resolving disputes through negotiation and leverage rather than force, was a vulnerability that could be exploited by someone willing to make the first aggressive move and hold the position long enough to establish a new reality. Ashworth was betting that Bumpy would not respond to the territorial expansion with the kind of escalation that would cost both operations money and attract law enforcement attention. He was betting, in other words, that Bumpy's methods were a limitation rather than a strength. This was the same mistake that men made about Bumpy Johnson with a regularity that never ceased to instruct him about the persistent human tendency to confuse restraint with weakness. 11 days before that Tuesday night, a man named Marcus Cole, who worked in the kitchens of a restaurant in Gerald Ashworth's neighborhood, had mentioned to a cousin of his who worked in Bumpy's organization that 3 men had been seen meeting with Ashworth on 2 consecutive evenings, and that the men did not look like numbers men or business associates. They looked like the specific category of men that you hire when you have decided that a problem cannot be solved any other way. Bumpy had taken this information and spent the next 11 days doing what he always did with information, not acting on it immediately, but learning everything it could teach him about what was going to happen and what it would mean when it did. He learned the names of the 3 men within 4 days, because the circles in which men like Webb, Dexter, and Prince operated were smaller than those men typically realized. And Bumpy had spent 15 years cultivating relationships throughout those circles that gave him access to information that his counterparts in other organizations would not have thought to gather. He knew who had done this work before and who used them and what the outcomes of those prior engagements had been. Webb and Dexter were straightforward, capable men with straightforward histories. Prince was more interesting. Prince had a reputation that went beyond simple competence. He was, by the accounts of the people who had worked with him and opposite him, genuinely exceptional at reading situations and adapting to things that hadn't gone according to plan. This was useful information because it told Bumpy that the plan Gerald Ashworth had purchased was not simply the application of force. It was the application of force managed by someone smart enough to respond to complications, which meant that the complications Bumpy intended to introduce needed to be significant enough that even Prince's considerable adaptability would not be sufficient to navigate them without Bumpy's cooperation. Over the following week, Bumpy learned other things. He learned that Clarence Webb had a younger brother in the 3rd year of a mechanical engineering program at City College, a fact that Webb kept carefully separate from his professional life, but that explained certain financial decisions Webb had made over the preceding 2 years that had struck people who knew him as uncharacteristically conservative. He learned that Roy Dexter had spent 3 years in the early 1940s in a different kind of work, legitimate work, specifically as a draftsman for a small architectural firm in the Bronx that had gone out of business in 1944. And that Dexter had a portfolio of technical drawings that the firm's principal, before his death, had described in a letter to a professional association as among the most precise he had encountered in 30 years of practice. He learned that Prince, the one whose name no one used and whose history was the hardest to trace, had a daughter in a hospital in Queens who had been receiving treatment for a respiratory condition for 14 months, and whose medical costs had been managed through a combination of hospital charity programs and the income from work that Prince had been doing with increasing frequency as those costs accumulated. Bumpy sat with these 3 facts for 3 days before he understood fully what to do with them. Then he made arrangements, specific arrangements, of the kind that required several conversations with people in various institutions and organizations across the city. Conversations that Bumpy conducted personally rather than through intermediaries, because the precision required was the kind that did not survive translation. On the evening of March 14th, he sent his regular Tuesday companions home early, told the backroom staff that he would be in the corner booth if needed, and settled in with his book and his whiskey to wait for 22 minutes past 11, which was the time he had been told the 3 men planned to arrive. He heard them before he saw them, not their footsteps, the backroom's floor-absorbed sound, but the quality of the silence that preceded them through the door, the particular silence of men who are moving with intent through a space they have planned to move through. When the door opened and the 3 of them came in, Bumpy was reading. He finished the sentence he was on before he looked up. Clarence Webb was in front, which made sense given his size and the role it implied. Roy Dexter was to his left and slightly behind, which also made sense. Prince came last, which was where Bumpy had expected to find him, because a man whose primary value is his judgment positions himself where he can see everything before he commits to anything. Bumpy looked at the 3 of them for a moment. Then he closed his book on his finger to keep the page and said the last thing any of the 3 men had expected to hear. He said, "I've been waiting for you. Please sit down." The 3 seconds that followed were among the most instructive that Bumpy had witnessed in years, because they revealed, in the specific way that unexpected words revealed things, exactly what each of the 3 men was made of. Webb's hand, which had been moving toward his jacket, stopped. His face showed confusion. Then the particular recalibration of a man who has encountered a response so far outside his prepared framework that the framework itself is briefly unavailable to him. Dexter took a half-step backward, which was not retreat exactly, but the instinctive repositioning of a man who wants more information before he decides which direction to move in. Prince did nothing. He stood exactly where he had been standing, and his expression did not change, and his eyes did not move from Bumpy's face, and the quality of his attention intensified rather than shifted. This was the response of a man who had understood, in the same instant the words landed, that something had happened that he had not planned for, and that the correct response to an unplanned variable was to gather more data before acting. Bumpy watched all of this in approximately 2 seconds and confirmed several things he had suspected about each of them. Then he gestured at the 3 chairs across the booth from him, the ones he had arranged before they arrived, and waited. Prince sat down first, which surprised the other 2 and which Bumpy had expected. A man whose value is his judgment knows that information is always more useful than action when action can be postponed. And sitting down was the fastest way to get more information. Webb sat down second, following Prince's lead in the particular way of men who trust the judgment of the smartest person in their group. Dexter remained standing for a moment longer, his back step not yet reversed, and then he sat down too, because the alternative was to be the only person in the room still standing, which would have required him to explain to himself why that position was preferable to the one everyone else had chosen. "I know why you're here," Bumpy said, when they were seated. "I know who sent you. I know what they paid you, and I know what they told you about me that made you confident enough to come. He paused and poured a small amount of whiskey into each of 3 glasses that had been placed on the table before they arrived. Not a large amount. Enough to be a gesture. "I'm going to tell you some other things now," he continued. "Things about each of you that the man who hired you doesn't know and wouldn't have thought to find out. And when I'm done, I'm going to make you an offer. Not a threat, an offer. And you're going to think about it before you decide." Prince said something then. He said, "You had those glasses set up before we came in." "That's correct," Bumpy said. "You knew exactly when we'd arrive." "I knew approximately," Bumpy said. "I gave myself a 40-minute window. You came in on the earlier side." Prince looked at the glasses, looked at Bumpy, and then did something that Webb and Dexter would later describe, independently and with the same word, as unsettling. He smiled. Not a friendly smile, not a threatening one. The smile of a man who has just understood that he is in the presence of someone operating at a level that he had not encountered before, and that this fact was, to him, more interesting than frightening. "Go ahead," Prince said. Bumpy turned to Clarence Webb first. He talked for approximately 4 minutes about Webb's brother, about the engineering program, about the specific scholarship that had covered the first 2 years and the gap in funding that had made the 3rd year difficult and the 4th year, which Webb was currently financing through the work he took, a subject of considerable private anxiety. He mentioned no amounts. He mentioned no specifics that could not be known by someone who had taken the trouble to learn them. He spoke in the measured voice of a man reading from a document he has memorized, which in a sense he was. Webb said nothing for a long moment after Bumpy stopped. Then he asked how. "I pay attention to people," Bumpy said. "It's the most useful habit I've developed." He turned to Roy Dexter and spoke for 3 minutes about the architectural firm, about the portfolio, about a competition that Dexter had entered under a pseudonym in 1943 that had placed second in its category, and that the competition's organizing body still had on record as belonging to a name that Dexter had not used since the firm closed. He mentioned a specific drawing from that portfolio, a detail in the structural section of a residential building design, that a practicing architect of Bumpy's acquaintance had described, when shown a copy, as solving a load-bearing problem in a way he had not seen before and would not have thought of himself. Dexter's expression during this recitation was not confusion. It was the expression of a man being shown something he had put away and not thought about in years. Something he had filed under the category of a life that had not happened rather than a life that was still possible. When Bumpy stopped, Dexter did not ask how. He asked why. Why did it matter? "Because," Bumpy said, "it tells me something about you that I need to know before I make you an offer." Then he turned to Prince. He said less than he had said to the other 2. He spoke for approximately 90 seconds, and what he said was about the hospital in Queens and the respiratory condition and the 14 months and the costs that had accumulated and the specific nature of the treatment that was working but that the hospital's charity program covered only partially, and that Prince's current rate of income covered adequately in good months and inadequately in bad ones. When he finished, the back room was quiet for a long time. The sound of the main room filtered through the wall. Music, conversation, the ordinary business of a Tuesday night at the Cotton Club. None of the 3 men across from Bumpy spoke. Each of them was doing the particular internal work of a person who has just had the geography of their situation rearranged without their permission. Prince spoke first. He asked whether the information Bumpy had shared with each of them was known to the man who had hired them. "No," Bumpy said. "Gerald Ashworth hired the reputation. He didn't hire the people." Prince nodded slowly. This was, Bumpy understood, Not a nod of agreement, but of recognition. The recognition of a man who has just understood the full shape of a situation and is filing it correctly. "Here is the offer," Bumpy said. "I want to say first that it is not conditional on anything that hasn't already happened. You walked in, you sat down, you listened. The offer exists, regardless of what you decide." He placed 3 envelopes on the table, one in front of each of them. The envelope in front of Clarence Webb contained a letter on City College letterhead, confirming a scholarship for the final 2 years of a mechanical engineering program, funded through an alumni foundation with no requirement other than continued enrollment and academic standing. The scholarship had been arranged 4 days earlier. The envelope in front of Roy Dexter contained a letter from a practicing architect, the same one who had reviewed the drawing, offering a position as a senior draftsman at a firm that was expanding and needed precisely the kind of technical mind that Dexter's portfolio demonstrated. The position was legitimate, the salary was stated, and the offer was genuine and open for 60 days. The envelope in front of Prince contained a letter from a hospital administrator in Queens, confirming that the ongoing treatment costs for a patient in the respiratory ward would be covered in full for the duration of treatment, through a private charitable fund administered by the hospital, with no conditions attached and no record of the arrangement's origin to be shared with the patient or her family. "Open them," Bumpy said. "Take whatever time you need." What followed was the longest silence of the evening. Not uncomfortable exactly. Bumpy had learned long ago that silence was not something to be filled out of nervousness, and the 3 men across from him were not, any of them, the kind of men who filled silences out of nervousness. They read carefully. Webb read his letter twice. Dexter read his once, and then sat for a long time looking at the table surface. Prince read his in perhaps 20 seconds and then sat very still with the letter flat in front of him, both hands resting beside it, not touching it. "Why?" Prince said finally. Not the why of a man asking for justification. The why of a man who needs to understand the logic before he can evaluate the offer. Bumpy had prepared for this question because it was the right question, and Prince was the kind of man who asked right questions. Because, he said, "I don't want enemies I can prevent." And because everything in those envelopes is something that was already true about each of you. Something you earned or something you need that had nothing to do with tonight. I'm not buying your loyalty. I'm acknowledging something that already exists and making sure it has room to develop. He picked up his whiskey glass and set it down again without drinking. Gerald Ashworth hired you to solve a problem he created by making a decision without thinking it through. That's a management failure, not a business dispute, and management failures don't get better over time, they get more expensive. Whatever he paid you to come here tonight, it was part of a larger cost he's going to keep paying for a decision that isn't going to produce what he wanted it to produce. He looked at each of the 3 men in turn, the same focused attention he gave to everything he considered worth understanding. "What I'm offering," he said, "is not a replacement for what he hired you for. It's a different kind of arrangement entirely. I don't need men to come through unmarked doors late at night. I need men who understand that this city works through relationships, and that relationships work through people understanding what other people actually need. What's in those envelopes is what I know each of you actually needs. If you can help me understand what other people actually need on an ongoing basis, then we have the beginning of something that's worth considerably more to both sides than whatever tonight was supposed to accomplish." Clarence Webb put his letter back in its envelope and placed it in his jacket pocket. This was, Bumpy knew, a decisive gesture, not agreement exactly, but the physical acknowledgement that the letter was his, and that he was taking it with him regardless of what he decided about anything else. Roy Dexter was looking at his letter again. He asked whether the position was real. "Call the number on the letterhead tomorrow morning," Bumpy said. "Ask for Thomas Greer. He'll be expecting your call." Dexter folded the letter and put it in his coat. Prince had not moved his hands from beside the letter. He asked one more question. He asked what the ongoing arrangement would look like, in practical terms. Not what it would be called or how it would be described. What it would actually require of them. Bumpy told them. He was precise and honest and not particularly romantic about it, because the men across from him were not men who responded to romance, and because the arrangement he was describing was genuinely what it was. A relationship built on mutual interest and the specific skills each of them had demonstrated, through entirely different means, over the course of the evening. By 20 minutes past midnight, less than 2 hours after they had come through the unmarked door, the three of them had agreed, not because Bumpy had threatened them, not because the contents of the envelopes were so generous that refusal was irrational, though they were generous. Not even entirely because what he was offering was better than what they had been hired to do, though it was. They agreed because Bumpy Johnson had done something that Gerald Ashworth, in all his planning and all his expenditure, had not thought to do. He had paid attention to them, not to their reputations, or their capabilities, or their availability, or their price. To them, to the specific people they were, the things they had built and lost and needed and carried. He had spent 11 days learning who they were before they arrived. And he had used that knowledge not to neutralize them, but to acknowledge them. And the acknowledgement had accomplished what no threat could have accomplished, and no payment alone could have sustained. They left through the same door they had come in, at 12:22 in the morning. Bumpy sat alone for a while after they left, finishing his whiskey and his chapter, in the particular quiet of a man who has done something difficult and done it well and is allowing himself the moment of stillness that such a thing earns before the next thing begins. The next morning, Gerald Ashworth received a message. The message was brief and came through channels that Ashworth recognized as belonging to Bumpy Johnson's organization. It said that the 3 men he had hired were no longer available and that their unavailability was permanent. It said that the question of the Western expansion remained open for discussion on terms that Ashworth would find fair if he chose to discuss them. And it said that if Ashworth chose not to discuss them, Bumpy would consider the matter resolved in the way he saw fit, which would not be the way Ashworth had hoped. Ashworth chose to discuss them. The conversation happened 4 days later, in a restaurant on a neutral block, and it lasted an hour and a half. Afterward, the Western expansion was reversed. The independent runners were returned to their previous status, and an acknowledgement was made in the form of a modest but not insignificant payment that represented, in the understood language of these arrangements, an admission that a line had been crossed and a commitment that it would not be crossed again. The conversation itself was unremarkable by the standards of these things. What was remarkable, and what people talked about for years afterward in the particular way that Harlem talked about things it recognized as significant, was what had happened before the conversation, the 3 men, the back room, the envelopes, the 2 hours. Clarence Webb enrolled his brother in City College's 4th year. He himself began working for Bumpy's organization in a capacity that was almost entirely unremarkable from the outside, managing relationships, tracking information, the kind of middle distance, organizational work that makes large operations function without anyone being entirely sure who is responsible for making them function. He was very good at it, better than his previous work had suggested he would be, because it turned out that the quality of attention he had brought to his earlier work, the ability to read rooms, To understand what people needed before they articulated it was considerably more valuable in the context Bumpy provided than it had been in the context where Ashworth had found him. Roy Dexter called Thomas Greer on a Wednesday morning. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. He started work at the firm the following Monday. He stayed for 7 years, until the firm dissolved during a difficult period for New York's construction industry. And in those 7 years, he became known among the architects and engineers who worked with him as the most technically precise draftsman any of them had encountered. He won 2 awards under his own name, awards that he had not known to want before the conversation in the back room of the Cotton Club had reminded him that wanting them was still available to him. He maintained a separate, careful relationship with Bumpy's organization throughout those years, and what he provided through that relationship was not muscle or menace, but the specific kind of technical knowledge that proved useful in ways that nobody would have predicted when the relationship was formed. Prince became, over the following years, something that had no good name in the context of Harlem's organizational landscape, but that everyone who understood the landscape recognized as essential. He was the person Bumpy sent when something needed to be understood completely before anything was done about it. He was the person who sat in the corner of rooms and watched, and came back afterward with an account of what had happened that was more complete and more useful than any other account that could have been produced. He brought his attention, which was absolute, and his patience, which was extraordinary, to the work of understanding situations that other people found opaque. And he was paid well for it, and the medical costs in Queens were covered entirely through the arrangement Bumpy had put in the envelope, and the condition eventually resolved. And the girl grew up and became a schoolteacher in the Bronx, and she never knew any of this. What this episode taught the people who knew about it, and not many did, not the full version, because the full version was the kind of thing that each of the 3 men kept private for their own reasons, was something that they already knew in theory, but had not seen demonstrated so precisely in practice. The theory was that people are not their reputations, that a man hired for one purpose contains, within him, the capacity for different purposes, and that the person who understands this capacity and addresses it directly can accomplish things that the person who understands only the reputation cannot. That the most durable form of loyalty is not the kind purchased by fear or money, but the kind produced by a moment of recognition, the moment when someone who had not been seen clearly is, for the first time, seen. Bumpy had known this for years. He had learned it through observation and experience and the particular education of a man who had grown up in circumstances that required him to understand people more accurately than most people need to, because the cost of misunderstanding them was higher. He had refined it through practice, through the hundreds of conversations and situations and relationships that had built his organization into what it was by 1947. And he had applied it in that back room with a precision that was possible only because he had done the work beforehand. The 11 days of learning, the 4 days of arrangement, the 40-minute window with 3 glasses already poured. Gerald Ashworth's organization contracted over the following 3 years. Not dramatically, he was a careful man, and he was careful about how he managed the contraction, but consistently, in the particular way that organizations contract when their best people find better situations and the decisions at the top show a persistent weakness in understanding what makes people stay. By 1950, Ashworth himself had moved to a different city and a different business, and the eastern section of Harlem that his operation had served was absorbed quietly and without incident into the larger structure that Bumpy had been building for 15 years. The back room at the Cotton Club continued to be lit on Tuesday nights for years after that. Bumpy's Tuesday companions returned the following week, unaware of what had happened the week before, and things resumed in the ordinary way of things that have a rhythm established enough to survive occasional interruptions. The 3 chairs that had been arranged across the corner booth were unremarkable chairs, the kind that exist in the back rooms of establishments all over the city, and nobody who sat in them afterward would have known what had been decided in them on a Tuesday night in March. But the whiskey glasses, 3 of them, small, arranged with the care of things placed intentionally, were noticed once. Years later, by a young man who had come to work for Bumpy's organization and who had been told to wait in the back room while a conversation finished in the main hall. He noticed the 3 glasses on the corner booth table, already set out, though no one was sitting there yet, and he asked one of the staff about them. The staff member, who had worked at the Cotton Club for 11 years, and who had been present on the night in question without understanding what she was seeing, said only that Mr. Johnson sometimes had guests on Tuesday nights, and that the glasses were always set up before the guests arrived. The young man asked whether the guests knew they were expected. Sometimes, the staff member said, and sometimes that's the whole point. The young man thought about this for a while. It was the kind of answer that contained more than it appeared to, and he was young enough that he wasn't sure he had understood all of it. He filed it under the category of things he would think about later, when he had more information. He thought about it later, many times, and each time he did, he understood a little more of what the woman had meant, and a little more of what it meant to run an organization the way Bumpy Johnson ran his, which was not through force or fear or the accumulation of obligations, but through the specific, demanding, patient work of understanding people well enough to show them something true about themselves at the exact moment when that truth was most useful. This was what made the 3 chairs in the corner booth a story worth telling, and what made it a story that people who knew it told carefully and only to people they trusted to understand it. It was not a story about power, exactly, or about strategy, or about the particular genius of a man who prepared for things other people didn't think to prepare for. It was a story about what becomes possible when you pay enough attention to people to see them accurately, and what that kind of seeing can accomplish in a room where everyone else is operating on assumptions that were never quite right. 3 men came through an unmarked door to end something. They left through the same door, having begun something. The difference between those 2 versions of the same night was 11 days of work that nobody saw. 3 envelopes prepared with the care of things that matter, and the specific quality of attention that Bumpy Johnson brought to every person he ever needed to understand. Some men build organizations through fear. Some build them through money. Some build them through the accumulated weight of a reputation that makes opposition seem irrational. Bumpy Johnson built his through something that was harder to acquire and harder to replace than any of those things, and that lasted longer than any of them when they failed, which they always eventually did. He built it through knowing people well enough to offer them something true when they least expected it. In a room they had come to for a different reason entirely, at 22 minutes past 11 on a Tuesday night in March, with 3 glasses already poured and a book open on the table and all the time in the world to wait for the door to open. The door always opened. He always knew when,